Good afternoon from Brussels. Good morning, America, and welcome to the register participants, members of SEPS and viewers on YouTube to this webinar on the 2020 U.S. presidential elections, where we zoom in on what policies U.S. but also Europe should expect for the upcoming 4 years. I'm Stephen Blockmans. I'm the director of SEPS, and the next hour of this exciting day is reserved for a conversation with former Senator and Majority Leader Tom Daschle. It has been facilitated by ACI, which is a Brussels-based firm that provides services in the field of EU law and public policy, and that bridges to Washington, D.C., that other policy and regulatory center in the world. And this webinar is also co-organized by the Daschle Group, a strategic advisory firm which is led by former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, its founder and CEO. So good morning and welcome to you, Senator Daschle.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for your kind introduction and the opportunity to be with you, and welcome all the SEPS members, and want to especially thank Heron Aquis and Mac Bernstein from DLA Piper, and thank my son, the CEO of the Daschle Group, Nathan Daschle, for their work in organizing this with SEPS and with you, Stephen.
Can I briefly still introduce you before you veer into your opening remarks?
Absolutely, that'd be fine. I thought you just did, but I'd be more than happy to turn the floor back to you.
I would like to at least impart on our audience that you've participated in the development and debate of almost every major public policy issue of the last 3 decades. In 1978, elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, in which you served for 8 years. In 1986, elected to the U.S. Senate, and then chosen as Senate Democratic leader in 1994. Uniquely, one of the longest serving Senate Democratic leaders in history, but only one of 2 to serve twice, both as first minority and later majority leader. So, I mean, that gives you an extremely deep insight, of course, in the functioning of government, of the legislative branch, on which we would like to touch a bit today. You've written about these issues, not only on the fundamentals of American government, but also as an expert in health policy. You've published books in that particular area, and you remain active on issues such as climate change, food security, and renewable energy policy. But what stood out for me in your bio is, especially given the polarized times the U.S. is currently living through, is that in 2007, you joined with former majority leaders George Mitchell, Bob Dole, and Howard Baker to create what is called the Bipartisan Policy Center, a think tank dedicated to finding common ground on some of the most pressing policy issues of our time. And we look forward to hearing what you consider that common ground to still hold, and how it might be enlarged. Now, we've agreed amongst ourselves that indeed you will present us with your introductory remarks before we open the conversation, also with our online audience that is growing by the numbers. And if those members of the audience have any questions, then please use the Q&A function in Zoom, which SEPS will curate to make sure that the most pertinent and interesting questions get priority. We know that there's also quite some firepower in the virtual room, so we might also turn to some of you. Be ready to be called, be decent this morning when called upon to pose a question during the discussion. Now with that, Senator Daschle, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you again, Stephen, for that very kind and generous introduction. And again, welcome to all of those who are participating this afternoon. I would begin by observing that I believe the American people have experienced a political season unlike any in American history. It has been the wildest political roller coaster ride that any American has endured in their lifetime. It is driven by five primary factors. First, the coronavirus pandemic that has killed now over 250,000 Americans. We're 4% of the population, but 20% of the world's cases. The economic crisis, secondly, has caused the loss of tens of thousands of American businesses and tens of millions of American jobs. So that's the second factor. The third factor is social unrest that has led to increasing violence and deep divisions in cities and states throughout the nation. The fourth factor was the death of Justice Ginsburg and control of the Supreme Court for decades to come. And the fifth factor, very frankly and bluntly, is that we have a president who thrives on sowing deep division and chaos. The landscape is even more complicated by the unprecedented number of voters, now estimated to be more than 100 million, who have voted by mail or ahead of elections. That is an all-time historic record in the United States. This in spite of the fact that Americans abroad, the military, and voters in 6 states, including the president, have always voted by mail over the years. And yet the president has been partially successful in sowing doubt about the validity of the mail-in ballots this year. And we might see a number of legal challenges post-election to those mail-in ballots. So the combination of the volume and the legal challenges around them may complicate getting the results in a timely fashion. Although the race has tightened, Joe Biden's lead has been largely stable through the summer and fall. Polls indicate a Biden lead of about 6 to 8 points today on Election Day. However, it should be noted that because Republicans can win more electoral votes with fewer popular votes, Biden has to garner 4 more percentage points just to be even. So let's say a 6-point lead is actually closer to a 2-point lead. Just as importantly, with the campaign now over, Biden and Trump are virtually even in several of the so-called swing states. As we begin Election Day, I would give Joe Biden about a 60% chance of winning the election sometime this week. Although now some pollsters are predicting a Biden landslide. He certainly has an easier way to get to the 270 electoral votes needed to win than does President Trump. Both candidates have had 2 primary objectives throughout the campaign: energize and motivate their bases and persuade undecided voters. Trump has used many themes over the course of the summer to do both. His dominant theme has been law and order, taking a page almost verbatim from Richard Nixon's successful campaign in 1968. Joe Biden's primary themes have attempted to address 4 of the 5 factors that I mentioned earlier: promising plans to address the pandemic successfully, the economic crisis, racial inequality, and the lack of presidential leadership. But the Supreme Court vacancy has also become one of the dominant issues for both candidates for the last month of the campaign. 3 primary developments have affected the race: the 2 presidential debates. Because of both their ages and temperament, the candidates' performance in the 2 debates had a consequential impact on undecided voters. That is especially true of the first debate, where President Trump appeared to be unhinged. He received very negative reviews. Given the closeness of the race, it could easily have meant the difference between victory and defeat for both candidates. The second factor were what we commonly call in the United States October surprises, In 2016, there were two huge surprises in the final weeks of the campaign: the Clinton emails and the Trump Hollywood tapes. They appear to have canceled each other out. The first one for this cycle occurred early in September with the death of Justice Ginsburg and is politically earth-shaking. No one has yet fully calculated the political consequences of that circumstance. The third component affecting the outcome of the race has been the perception of the state of the first three factors on Election Day: how the country has perceived the coronavirus pandemic, the economic crisis, and social unrest in the days leading up to the election will have significant consequences for both candidates. Trump will benefit if the circumstances are perceived to be improving. Biden will benefit if they are not. On Election Day, the perception is still mixed. The economy shows signs of improvement, but the coronavirus has worsened. The country is now experiencing nearly 100,000 new cases a day. There is one more factor that may or may not affect the race, and that is foreign interference. In a recent poll, 75% of all American voters say it is likely that Russia and China, in particular, will attempt to influence the presidential election. Less than half express confidence in the government's efforts to stop them. Cybersecurity and social media manipulation are an increasing problem for democratic elections, not only in the United States, but worldwide. Given the closeness of the presidential race, it is likely to be a determining factor this year. As we finally now reach Election Day, Democrats have a slight edge in winning the majority in the United States Senate. Prospects today are slightly better than 50-50. Republicans have 38 senators that are either safe or not running for election. Democrats have 40. Republicans have 8 Senate seats that they are likely to win. This takes them to 46. Democrats have 5. That takes them to 45. There are currently 9 toss-up races. 7 of the 9 are in states with a Republican incumbent. In presidential years, close Senate races are oftentimes affected by voter turnout and the top of the ballot outcome in the states. The battle for the confirmation of the seat on the Supreme Court last month was also a factor in these elections. Each of the senators in close races felt enormous political pressure to please their base while not alienating swing voters. It has been a factor for control of the Senate for the final weeks of this campaign. In the U.S. House of Representatives, there are 159 safe Republican and 180 safe Democratic seats. 31 seats lean Republican, while 34 Democratic. Due primarily to decades of what we commonly call gerrymandering, there are now 31 toss-up seats, merely 1/10 of the membership. With 214 likely Democrats, they only need 4 of the toss-up seats to maintain control. Their prospects for doing so are 100%. Given the closeness of the races for both president and the Senate, a worrisome scenario, the recognition that perhaps half of the country may challenge the validity of the election. President Trump's relentless efforts to sow doubt and confusion have been successful. Few Republican office holders have challenged his false and misleading assertions regarding mail-in ballots. This concern is exacerbated by the real possibility that because far more of his supporters may vote in person today, he may be leading in both the popular and the electoral vote tonight. It is entirely possible that he would declare himself the winner tonight before millions of absentee and mail-in ballots are counted. In the days both before and following the election, legal challenges to many of the ballots due to questions involving signatures, postmarks, and eligibility status could delay the final outcome for days, if not weeks, as we experienced in Florida in 2000 and both Florida and Georgia in 2018. Those circumstances could easily trigger demonstrations, violence, and great civil unrest. It could also involve a Supreme Court, once again, where potentially 3 justices that he appointed may be serving. It also may necessitate a congressional involvement. If no candidate wins a majority of the electoral vote, the presidential election is thrown to the House of Representatives, where each state gets 1 vote. The vice president election goes to the Senate, where each senator casts their vote individually. I sincerely hope that these circumstances are unlikely, but it is not an exaggeration to assert that the future of the American Democratic Republic is at stake in ways unlike any other in American history. There is a great deal of understandable curiosity about what a Biden administration might be like and the priorities to governance that they would begin to take. Here, I must emphasize that I am not speaking as a spokesman for the campaign, so anything I say is my opinion only and not that of Joe Biden or his campaign. But based on his campaign positions, speeches, and long governmental experience, there are a number of assertions that one can make about his governance approach and be relatively confident in the accuracy of your predictions. I would expect that a Biden administration would enter office with at least 5 specific priorities. First and foremost, they are determined to create an effective national plan to confront the coronavirus pandemic. The Trump administration has largely left that responsibility to the states. A Biden administration would attempt to create far more coordination around testing, treatment, and the administration of potential vaccines. There is an expectation that regardless of the availability of vaccine, the pandemic will continue to pose unprecedented health and economic challenges for the United States and the rest of the world for at least 1 more year. Second, it is highly likely that a President Biden would put a high priority on economic recovery. While the economy is showing some improvement, there is still widespread unemployment and the likely permanent loss of thousands of small businesses, in addition to some major American brands. Third, Vice President Biden has emphasized the need to address pervasive racial and economic inequality in the states. The extraordinary civil strife that we have witnessed this year is an indication of the volatility and the extraordinary depth of feeling that exists around these issues. There are high expectations within Biden's Democratic base, and especially in the minority communities, that his administration will make this a high priority. It has huge implications for health, housing, education, and employment. Fourth, Biden has already been very vocal about the urgent need to address climate. It has been a central part of his campaign message. There is little doubt that a Biden administration would rejoin the Paris Climate Accord and would elevate the issue beyond that of any previous administration. He has promised to scrap all of the Trump environmental rollbacks and set a firm deadline for moving the nation to net zero emissions. He believes that global warming is an era-defining challenge, and it could actually represent a significant economic opportunity. Fifth, and finally, given his long interest in and engagement in foreign affairs, Joe Biden will make reestablishing U.S. international stature a major national priority. That has significant diplomatic, military, and economic ramifications. It also applies to the need for U.S. engagement in the effort to combat the COVID pandemic. I believe that one of President Biden's first decisions will involve restoring our membership in the World Health Organization in an effort to address the continued global challenge that the pandemic poses. He is an avid multilateralist. He believes in building coalitions and working with allies. He is a gregarious leader and will work to reestablish close personal relationships with leaders of other democratic republics. He has personally and passionately expressed his continued support for many of the commitments made by the United States involving our foreign relations. That was evident in September when he publicly proclaimed that he would vehemently oppose the Good Friday Agreement becoming a casualty of Brexit. Trade will continue to be a contentious issue in the United States. That has been evident again this year with the challenges in ratifying the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Even in the best of times, trade is not the most popular area for a president to spend political capital. Both the Republican and Democratic bases continue to express skepticism of international trade agreements. That skepticism is amplified by the state of the U.S. economy and the unprecedented loss of American jobs. But it would also be my hope and expectation that a Biden administration would attempt to reconstitute a WTO dispute settlement body and re-engage the EU in creating a working group on Chinese trade abuses. I have no doubt that as the United States continues to confront its many challenges with Russia, with China, and in foreign matters generally, the Biden administration will put great emphasis on working multilaterally. With all of the unknowns regarding the next several days, there is one certainty. If elected, Joe Biden will face a number of extremely difficult challenges that will equal or exceed almost any other administration in all of history. But as someone once said, difficulty is an excuse that history never accepts. So Stephen, with that, I will end my opening remarks and open it up to your questions and the comments made by people participating.
Thank you very much, Senator Daschle. And indeed, those questions are now starting to gently drip in. I do want to return to some of your opening remarks, if I may. You've painted quite a bleak scenario, essentially, all the uncertainties that govern the next few days, from the doubts that Mr. Trump himself has sown over the election process, to foreign interference, which may be ramped up in the next days, especially to benefit from the confusion that exists. You've painted, several hypotheses, basically. It's very difficult to sketch out any scenario, I understand. But given the fact that President Trump has put loyalists in many branches of government that would allegedly protect him, I refer to the Department of Justice, intelligence service and prosecution, basically. You refer to the Supreme Court and the role that it could play. How well do you think he might be protected in a legal, institutional sense to harness himself from any criticism that would come his way if indeed he proclaims elections won, even if he's lost them?
Well, that's a very good question. I think there are three scenarios that will unfold beginning this afternoon. The first scenario is that Joe Biden wins by the landslide that some predict. My confidence level about that scenario isn't as high as others, but nonetheless, if it's a landslide, it will make Trump's challenges to the process very, very difficult, and nobody, I think, will pay a great deal of attention to the legal consequences of that, because it will be so clear that Joe Biden has won categorically. A second scenario would be that Joe Biden does win, but it takes a while to establish his victory, given the closeness of the races in many of the swing states. And here, the increased likelihood of legal challenges becomes more problematic. But here again, I would say that, as you probably well know, and I'm sure most of our viewers understand, the election process in the United States is run at the state and local level, not at the federal level. And because it's run at the state and local level, there is a great deal of autonomy given to the states and local entities to decide what the rules for how votes are administered and tabulated and counted are decided. So that local autonomy, I think, could help us insulate from federal intervention. The worst case scenario is that it's very, very close and in all these states, and there is a plethora of legal challenges that work their way through the state courts, then the federal courts, and ultimately to the Supreme Court. That could take weeks, and if that occurs, the possibility, as I noted earlier, of increased violence and confrontation, I think, goes up exponentially. So you have not only legal challenges, but civil and confrontational challenges that I think could present some real nightmarish circumstances. We hope that that won't occur, but those are the three scenarios that one of which will play out over the course of the next several days.
Thank you. Taking a worst case scenario, which is the one that you probably worry most about, but Europeans do too. Do you think any lessons have been learned and could be implemented in case of a Biden win to put some guardrails, some legal defenses basically against abuse of power by the president and his administration? That would be one part of the question. And then secondly, having learned the lessons from this democratic process, which is convoluted, complex in the way you've described it, are there any initiatives underway of procedural, institutional, or other that may facilitate and parliamentarize a little bit more in the classical European sense, I reckon, the American Democratic Republic, as you call it?
Well, to your first question, I think it's highly likely that we will see in future elections the continued reliance on mail-in ballots. We have a number of states. There are 6 states that only vote by mail today. But I think that number will grow even after the coronavirus has been addressed successfully. I don't know what the final number will be, but in the overall tally, but as I said earlier, 100 million Americans have already voted either by mail or in person. So that's a trend. And I think the infrastructure will be designed in future elections to accommodate mail-in ballots and probably allow for the counting of those mail-in ballots before Election Day to speed up the process. That would go a long way. There are some states that already have that authority, but there are many states that still do not. So some degree of continuity and consensus around when the ballots can be counted and how they're administered, I think would really go a long way. To your second question, there are no checks on presidential power in cases of violence. We have a law that is called the Insurrection Act that was actually enacted in 1807, a long, long time ago. But the Insurrection Act allows the president to nationalize the National Guard and to call up military forces to be used on the streets of the United States. It's rarely been used, but in fact, the last time it was used were the riots in Los Angeles in the decades ago. I can't remember the exact year. But we're worried about the president using the Insurrection Act this year. And then, of course, he has the authority as well to declare martial law. Martial law then takes the next step, which allows him almost dictatorial powers to stop the vote count and to do many other things that would be unprecedented in American history.
Thinking that through, for a Biden administration, those would be topics worth addressing. And like Watergate, the scandal produced, well, several amendments. One would expect initiatives to crop up in this particular field as well, so as to curb presidential power. what should we think about beyond the issues that you've talked about?
Well, the problem we have, of course, is that the country is so deeply divided today. What I worry a little bit about, or quite a bit about, is our ability to reach consensus in public policy, given how divided the country is. The United States Senate, which I dearly love and served in for 18 years, is as dysfunctional today as I've ever seen it, in large measure because of the deep polarization and the unwillingness on the part of either side to come to some consensus. It's going to take leadership. It's going to take a new willingness to begin to govern again, a willingness to compromise, a willingness to find common ground. And that will not be easy. Joe Biden has a long history of that approach to legislating and working in government and different leadership roles. He will certainly make that effort again, but it will be difficult.
Right. Now, on mingling business and politics, as Mr. Trump has done, there might nevertheless be initiatives that find themselves into law, I suspect. But what you're saying is that the votes for any major constitutional change would certainly be missing. Not just that.
That's right. You need 2/3 of the states to approve a constitutional amendment. And given the divided state we find ourselves in today, I think passing a constitutional amendment would be nearly impossible.
Right. Now, you've talked a lot about, essentially the end to the changing nature in voting patterns, being solidified basically in two blocks and so deeply and widely polarized that it will take a huge effort to bridge the divide. Several of our audience members are asking, however, about policies, what to expect in designated fields. What at least do you think for Europeans would provide the constant? What will remain? What common ground, what bipartisan policies still exist, and especially in relation to foreign affairs?
Well, because the country is so deeply divided and because Trump has commanded such loyalty from Republicans, he's really, I've always called his role in the Republican Party a hostile takeover, because in many respects, the Republicans have changed their historic positions on so many issues as a result of Trump's dominance in the Republican Party. So I don't know post-Trump whether the Republicans will revert back to their original positions. It used to be that we would commonly assert that politics stopped at the water's edge. That is, we didn't invoke politics when it came to foreign policy. That hasn't always been the case. There were deep divisions around many of the wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam. So that hasn't always been the case. But by and large, we have had more of a bipartisan nature to foreign policy historically than on domestic policy. If I could hope, it would be that we would once again resume our understanding of the importance of multilateralism, that we would recognize the importance of American participation with our allies and develop an infrastructure once again around Bretton Woods and the extraordinary growth that we've seen globally and economically over the course of the last 70 years. That hasn't occurred by accident. That occurred because the leaders post-World War II had a vision for the world that we gradually embraced worldwide, both democratically and economically. And unfortunately, that has all been threatened over the course of the last not only 4 years, but I would say decade. And so we have a lot of work to do in restoring that confidence and that respect for our international infrastructure and the importance of American involvement in that infrastructure going forward.
Right. If I can press you a little bit on foreign policy issues, a lot of our audience members ask what a Biden policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, the wider Middle East, would look like, including also Turkey and Iran.
Well, my guess is that he would attempt to pick up where President Obama left off with Iran. We had an agreement. It was working. Unfortunately, the circumstances have deteriorated badly over the course of the last 4 years. And we've seen, once again, Iran's capacity for building a nuclear threat becoming far more real as a result of the Trump approach. Somewhat ironically, he was very critical of the Iranian agreement. So I don't know whether a Biden administration will be successful in putting the pieces back together. I suspect it'll be very, very difficult. But nonetheless, I think he will at least make the effort and certainly consult with our allies in Europe in particular as we begin to assess just how we might approach the challenges involving Iran. Turkey is in some ways even more complicated. They have been historically an ally in NATO, and we have worked closely together in the past. We have serious challenges right now with the governance in Turkey and circumstances there. I think he would have to approach our relationship with Turkey in a very gingerly manner, but nonetheless, I think again he would want to consult with allies in Europe and elsewhere to further appreciate just how we might go about building a more constructive relationship with Turkey, but recognizing the changes that have occurred there domestically over the course of the last several years.
So no return to the status quo ante, because the situation in so many cases has severely deteriorated. The international context has worsened as well, so that will prevent Biden from going back to the Obama year foreign policy. I mean, I suppose also because he will be constrained because of radical opposition on the right flank of the political spectrum.
No question. That won't go away, and they will be equally as vocal. They were increasingly vocal during the second term, well, during both terms of the Obama administration. I think they're now empowered by Trump, and Trump won't go away either if he's no longer president. He'll be a vocal participant and do as much as he can, it seems to me, to keep his base solidified and vocal.
Incidentally, do you think if he would lose Trump, that is, whether he would run again in 2024?
I think his daughter and his son may be interested in doing that. Trump's age becomes a factor in 2024, but I don't know, but I have been told that both his daughter and his son, Don Jr., have political aspirations nationally.
Right. I want to turn a little bit to Europe, if I may. Obama once described, or someone close to Obama once described the U.S. Treasury Department as the president's favorite combatant. And Europe, the European Union and its member states have been at the receiving end of the stick for quite some time. Now again, of course, over Iran and the withdrawal of the US from the JCPOA, it has tried to hedge against the long arm of US jurisdiction in this sense. Do you expect a President Biden to use that same tool as enthusiastically as Trump has?
I don't. I think that, again, Joe Biden recognizes how important it is that we attempt to repair our relationships worldwide. I think we've lost stature. I think that's widely recognized. There is a great deal of reparation required. And my guess is that Joe Biden will make a real personal effort and require of his entire administration to make an equally important effort to do all that we can to restore lines of communication and more cooperation as we address many of the challenges that we face collectively worldwide. That will certainly affect how we address the challenges presented by China, perhaps by Russia, by Iran, by circumstances in the Middle East. There are just a number of other challenges that I think require close consultation, and that will be Joe Biden's priority.
Could you drill down a little bit deeper on a Biden-Russia and a Biden-China policy? What should we expect as Europeans? Because it seems now that we're basically faced with a choice by the Trump-led White House. Decouple from China or face wrath?
Well, I think Joe Biden's approach would be more nuanced. It's not one of my favorite words, but I think it applies here. I think it is nuanced. There's no black and white. We know that China and the United States, China and Europe rely on each other for enormous trade volume and increasing trade volume. But we also know China has been an egregious violator of human rights. They've become increasingly confrontational in the South China Sea, militarily, diplomatically. They've made their presence much more well known in Africa and Latin America, elsewhere. And so it's a nuanced approach, and I think it's going to have to require a multilateral approach that recognizes the gray nature of this complex and very unpredictable relationship as it evolves. With China, as we all know, Trump has been, for whatever reason, extremely reluctant to criticize Putin. And I think Joe Biden will be perhaps less reluctant to do so. And I think he will be more vocal in his criticism. I think, of course, we don't want to raise the military tensions that could easily develop. So he will be very cautious, it seems to me, in not trying to trigger even greater military tension. But I do believe from an economic and a diplomatic point of view, Joe Biden will be more assertive.
Right. And in that line, it would be slightly easier perhaps for the European Union or Europe collectively with the Brits to defend their own position as well, I assume. But I mean, is it fair to characterize, though, as some here have done, that a Biden presidency would present perhaps different mood music, but not different realities in terms of policy implementation? I mean, I take your point on Russia, absolutely, but as far as China is concerned, it may be not decoupling and certainly not in the US interest to go as far as Trump has claimed it should, but probably he wouldn't press that hard either. So where do you think are those subtle differences then with a Biden policy on China in particular?
I think the first thing will be the rhetoric. Trump has been extremely confrontational rhetorically, and I think that has complicated circumstances immensely. He has referred to China as being the sole participant responsible for coronavirus spreading throughout the world, and he has been vocally critical of the Xi factors as we look both domestically in China and worldwide. He's used the tariffs in a trade war with China that I think has exacerbated circumstances as well. So I think rhetorically, a Joe Biden administration will likely become, as I said earlier, just more first multilateral, secondly, maybe more nuanced. I do think that it's not unlikely, it's entirely possible, I'll put it that way, that Xi will test President Biden early in his administration in some way, just to see what kind of reaction and try to judge for their purposes, just what the Biden administration will be like. I worry a great deal about Taiwan right now and where that may be headed. And so we have serious issues with China that are going to have to be addressed. But I know that there is little doubt in my mind that the first thing that a Joe Biden would do as he contemplates our relationship with China is to consult with our allies.
Which would be greatly appreciated, I'm sure, on this side of the Atlantic. You mentioned in your opening remarks that trade is not really a vote winner, and that previous presidents do not like to spend a lot of political capital on a theme which is not very popular. Nevertheless, it is highly necessary. In your introductory remarks, you focused primarily on the reconstitution of the WTO appellate body, the modernization of the WTO, and of course, in doing so with like-minded countries and blocs like the European Union. You've not talked much about transatlantic bilateral trade, and of course, TTIP already ran into the ground in the last year of the Obama presidency. Do you think there might be any expectation, and if so, when would you expect it, under a Biden presidency, that this dossier would be picked up in all of its glory, or rather in a segmented fashion?
Well, first of all, I should just make clear that I am a huge believer in multilateral trade agreements. I think they're essential, not only advantageous, they're essential to economic growth and world and global economic vitality. I was deeply disappointed that TTIP did not see its fruition 5 years ago, and I'm very hopeful that one day we will see a TTIP. I must say, I am pessimistic, at least in the short term, that any multilateral trade agreement is possible. And I would say that for two reasons. One, because of the extraordinary economic challenges that the United States is now facing domestically with the loss of 30 million jobs, it is highly unlikely, given the skepticism the American people have for the loss of jobs through trade agreements to other countries, that they would support a trade agreement now. But secondly, there's also an understandable concern about our reliance on international sources for key aspects of our ability to address the health crisis. The foreign sources for PPEs and medical equipment undermined and somewhat jeopardized our capacity to acquire the necessary supplies medically that have been needed in the coronavirus. And that has, again, raised skepticism about international agreements. So it's the international reliance on what are viewed to be key medical supplies and this concern about the economy generally that lead me to be somewhat pessimistic. At the end of the day, however, that has to change. We can't continue to be isolated globally when it comes to our international trade agreements. And I'm very hopeful that through some real leadership demonstration, we will begin to see a change in attitude and a recognition that these trade agreements are an asset economically and politically, not a liability.
Yeah, I would probably expect trade only to be picked up in the second half of a Biden presidency, at least bilateral trade issues, and the focus primarily being on WTO reform. Certainly, well, in the first half, hopefully then. I still have a question which was posed also in the chat box about NATO. Trump has of course threatened to walk away from NATO. What do you expect the Biden presidency to focus on in relation to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
Well, Vice President Biden has made very clear over the course of the campaign his strong belief in the importance of NATO and a recognition of the U.S. NATO partnership and its importance to us. So I don't think there's any doubt he will completely embrace the need for a strong NATO alliance. I do also expect. I think President Trump has argued vociferously about the importance of NATO contributions on the part of our EU allies and Europe in general, and I think that will be part of the sort of the expectation as we go forward. But Europe has contributed significantly more in recent years than they have historically, and I think that will also be recognized by a Biden administration. But it will be one that he will embrace, and I think he will do so enthusiastically.
Fair enough, but yet he would be tested, certainly by President Erdogan of Turkey, who's been sowing all kinds of mischief in the Eastern Mediterranean and also in Nagorno-Karabakh now. So that's an enormous thorn in the White House's side. How do you expect him to, Biden that is, to deal with such a leader who's also ready at testing Russia purchased S-400s?
Well, there are diplomatic and economic incentives or disincentives. There are ways with which to apply pressure. I think there's also a need to build relationships, and in this case, it may be almost impossible, but I think that Joe Biden will use whatever multilateral devices available that might apply pressure on leaders in this case that are not likely to comply just out of their own interests. But I do think that there's a great deal of interest on the part of many in the Democratic Party that we've got to be more assertive. We've got to be a little bit more aggressive and multilateral. Once again, I probably have referred to that more than I need to, but I think a recognition that we've got to look collectively at how we address these challenges, and we can't do it alone.
I'm conscious of time. We still have, we have less than 10 minutes to go. I wanted to ask you a few more personal questions, perhaps. But first, relate to the age of both candidates, a question that was also posed in the Q&A. How do you explain the inability of both parties to produce more acceptable younger candidates? Is this a signal of a major weakness of the U.S. political system, do you think?
Well, not necessarily. I think that we've had moments in our history. John Kennedy was representative of a new generation in 1960, and I think you can say without fear of contradiction that this is the last election of this generation. You're going to see a plethora of new members. And if you look at the House and Senate, the age has come down dramatically in the last couple of election cycles, in part because of all the younger, newer leaders. So it may be a reflection of many things at the top of the ticket. As you know, we had a very robust primary campaign this year, and Joe Biden was the oldest of the candidates. He happened to win for many reasons, in spite of age, but that was a factor. I think that it's highly likely you're going to see younger and more youthful representation in the House and Senate this year, and in future presidential elections beginning in the next, perhaps as early as the next cycle.
You were in the running for health secretary or healthcare advisor by Obama at one point. Would you consider, if asked, to serve in a Biden administration in that capacity or any other?
I don't think so. I've had the good fortune to serve in government in many different capacities in the House and Senate as leader for 10 years. And I was honored and flattered to be a part of the Obama campaign in 2008 and his transition team in 2008 and 9. But I think I've reached a point in my life where other factors have become more important. My personal life, my life with my family, and so I hope to be as supportive as I can of a President Biden and his administration, but probably not in appointive or elective office.
Senator Daschle, we've done quite a tour d'horizon, and you've touched with great expertise on many of complicated issues that will entertain us all in the days and if not months to come. Do you expect President Biden to take up the inauguration on the envisaged date in January?
Well, that's I have every confidence that that January 20th will once again be the date. It's of course a legal requirement that is when the president's inaugurated, and I am absolutely positive that by then we will have resolved any outstanding issues, and we will be able to witness that inauguration with confidence.
So Europeans should not worry too much about the changing nature, democratic nature of their closest ally?
Well, there's an old expression that only the paranoid survive, and I think we have to be sufficiently paranoid. But I do believe that the American people, you know what I take great pride in is the realization that we've already seen 100 million people who have seen their vote as important this year. That's unprecedented. I don't know if there are many other countries that can boast that level of participation in an election year, percentage-wise or in total number. But that's a key illustration of the confidence and the respect and the importance that the American people put in the democratic process in this country.
With those hopeful words, I think we can close. Senator Daschle, thank you so much for tuning in this morning, for you at least, on this exciting election day. Thank you to the audience, and especially the active members of the audience who posed many questions, a handful of which I could only relay to the senator. Thank you so much for your time, for your interest. Look forward to staying in touch and following what will come next out of this important day. Senator Daschle, thanks again.
Absolutely.